Yeah,
I was seeing more extras of.
That was something, but
yes, it was.
Okay, we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is a regular meeting of Stuart Municipal Utilities. It's Thursday, July 13th, 2023. We'll take the roll call. Kim?
Here.
Brian?
Here.
I'm here. Shirley is not. And Craig?
Here.
This includes agenda approval and the consent agenda, which includes the minutes of the regular meeting of June 8th, 2023, and the joint meeting of June 12th, 2023. Financial statement as of 6/30/2023, and the bills as presented. When you're ready to do that, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Moved by Kim. Second by Brian. How do you vote? Kim?
Yes.
Brian?
Yep.
I vote aye. And Craig?
Aye.
Next item is 5A, Schneider and Associates Caldwell Tanks Pay Application. There's no questions, I'll ask for a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion.
Moved by Craig,
I'll second.
seconded by Kim. How do you vote, Brian?
Yes.
I vote aye. Craig?
Aye.
And Kim.
Yes.
And 5B, there's a pay application for Great Plains Contractors. Is there a motion to approve?
I'll make the motion.
Motion by Kim,
I'll second.
second by Craig. How do you vote? I vote aye. Craig?
Aye.
Kim?
Yes.
And Brian?
Yes.
Do we have a, Jeff's not here tonight.
you know, Jeff's not really here, or Jeff isn't here tonight, but I guess the biggest update would be the fact that a lot of this is gonna be done by the end of August, first part of September. We're looking at having water in the water tower by the first part of September. And the water mains should all be put in by the end of August, and they're moving right along and hooking up services too. So I think Great Plains is planning on being out of here sometime in September, which is way ahead of schedule. They have until like next April to get it done. So things are moving along pretty well.
How are they going to trench and hook up the water system to the new water tower? How's that gonna, is that
So
gonna?
they've already started on it. They're gonna tie it in over here on Division Street, and you've probably seen the equipment sitting out there. And then I think they're tying in again south of the water tower. Is that right?
On Fremont, yeah.
Yep. Off the Fremont.
Okay,
So, and the same contract, Great Plains is doing that. Originally, it was gonna be somebody else, but they just didn't have the time, so Great Plains took that over. They're doing that as well. And they got started on that this week, and then they kinda got rained out.
okay.
Pat, I don't know if you can answer this, but in the end, I mean, what?
I have no answer.
What is the state Great Plains is going to be leaving all of the disturbed dirt?
They are supposed to come back, they're supposed to level it out, and they're supposed to seed.
Okay, I wasn't sure if leveling was going to be included in part of that, or if
Yes.
they were just going to leave
They were
it
supposed
settle naturally.
Well, it would probably be better if they would do a little bit, just leave it, but they wanna be out of here so they can get their last pay app and everything, so they're planning on being done with all that by the first week of August, if everything goes according to plan.
Okay.
And, they're supposed to seed everything down, and I know we've been getting a few complaints from people.
That's a hot topic. So.
I'm glad I don't have Facebook.
He puts good remarks up.
But, yeah, That is part of their, contract, they have to do that.
Yeah, I just wasn't 100% sure if they were actually doing leveling or just let it naturally settle for the most part.
So I'm assuming they're probably keeping a retainer or something, or some sort of contingency to cover the
Yeah.
seeding in case
Oh,
they
yeah.
don't come back.
I talked to my son Patrick, BCAM got hooked up. He says, "God, Dad, there's a lot more water coming out of the faucet now."
Well, is Northwest Second hooked up?
Trevor, is it?
It's
not sure.
it's not tied in everywhere. They have some tie-ins to do
Like, up,
by you.
yeah,
Yes.
because when I've been watering flowers, I'm like, wow, there's more pressure. Are we hooked up?
Hooked up, but not all the tie-ins, so it could be even better. Could have better flow even.
Good.
I actually feel like I've lost pressure overall. It just seems like our system pressure's been lower. We're still not hooked up, obviously. So I felt that's been interesting. It's nothing that's been bad, but I know they've got everything one call, so I'm within the next few days.
It's not really
Well,
pressure,
next
it's
week
just
they'll
more
be
water.
doing yours.
So is North Gaines hooked up? Because I don't see any difference there.
No, they haven't done anything.
See, and I haven't seen no difference there.
They put the main in last year, but they haven't done any tie-ins on that.
I've noticed on mine after they hooked it up, just more volume, not really a lot more pressure, just more volume. My water pressure or volume used to go up and down because the water main was so corroded on the inside. It was about the size of a mop handle probably, but and as everybody on the same water main uses water, this is my theory, Dustin probably has different ones, but as more people on the same main use more water, I mean, the pressure goes down. And I don't have that anymore. That's the biggest thing I've noticed. It stays right there. And that's just my observation. Same pressure, just more volume.
Okay. Next item is Carl Chevrolet Utility Easement Agreement.
Remember when we talked about that last month with them, and they're gonna be on our easement down there in their next phase of their project.
We're gonna,
And there was basically it says if we can tear up their concrete if we have any trouble within our easement with the water, and we're not putting the concrete back, it'll be up to them.
and I think that's what we discussed before, was that it was their intention to,
And I think last month,
Concrete over there.
they didn't quite have this drawn up yet by their attorney, so.
Okay.
it's-
This has been looked at by ours.
I don't know that ours has looked at it.
Not yet.
But it needs to go to that.
Approval was submitted in September.
And the expense for that will go to Carl, we bill them for it, or have him, the attorney bill them directly. No, I'm serious.
We usually get the bill like the last 2 years. We do that even if it's building permit.
so do you want to approve this contingent upon our
Yes.
lawyer's approval?
Yes.
Okay, do I hear a motion for that?
I'll make that motion and then just also add that the legal fees go to.
Okay. Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, proceed to vote. Craig,
Aye.
Kim,
Yes.
Brian,
Yes.
and I vote aye. Okay, next item is DGR Engineering. The electric infrastructure planning.
Yes, thank you. Had a few slides, if you don't mind me plugging in.
Let me
Is that a
get
possibility?
things up and running.
Okay. I won't be as long this time. You probably remember me for going a while, so I apologize. I guess I'll just start introduction while she's getting things set up. But I'm Jared Lucy with DGR Engineering. I brought Blair Metzger with me today. just to kind of provide some background, we recently completed the electric system capital improvements plan update. And back in April 13th, I came and provided basically the results of our analysis of your guys' electric system, presented the capital improvements plan, the recommendations that we propose to address the deficiencies identified. So I'm going to quick touch on the numbers a little bit once this gets pulled up here. Wanted to just briefly touch on some of that stuff, just summarizing in case you need a refresher. But essentially, we're here to provide some more context in terms with the financial status of things. So, like I said, presented the results of our April 13th, at that April 13th meeting to you folks, and received some feedback. One of the things you requested was see where we're at, how does it impact the financial side of things and the rates over the next few years, and if these improvements are pursued by the board here. So tonight I want to just review that briefly and then bring Blair in to kind of update you guys on the rates. So without further ado, just to kind of remind everybody, you guys have had some steady growth over the last 10 years. So our study looked at the existing system peak of 3.7 megawatts as per this last summer, I believe, and then applying a steady growth factor, pretty modest, but adequate to provide some headroom for any additional future growth that you're not aware of at this time. So at the end of the day, these kind of drive the improvements that we recommended, along with some aging condition concerns. So essentially, where the improvements we targeted include primarily the reconstruction of the existing north substation, and then also some mainline distribution circuitry improvements in phase 2 after the north sub is completed. So hopefully you can see that fairly well, but what that looks like in a schematic basis is essentially retiring the existing north sub that's tied to that power plant, the 4160 voltage, system voltage that you have migrated away from with the underground conversion to the 12.5 kV system voltage. So goes hand in hand, the old 41.6 stuff, it's time that's retired. The existing transformer there at the north sub is also 41.6 low side, and so right now we're having to step up that voltage to tie into the existing 12.5 system that your remaining portion of your distribution system is operating at. So essentially, the north sub is reconstructed, and basically that comprises phase 1 of the capital improvements plan. Phase 2, like I mentioned, is addressing some backfeed and distribution efficiency in the south part of the system, which has been underground for some time. However, it's a lot of one-aught and sectionalizing cabinets, which limits the capacity of the circuits to about 180 amps, which is not adequate to backfeed the north portion of the system in the event that the north sub is lost or scheduled for maintenance, etc. It's that N-1 backfeed condition and also voltage drop deficiencies that we're addressing with these 2 phases. So wanted to recap the total costs we're looking at. The reconstruction of the north substation is estimated to be just under 5.1 million, all said and done. So there are some contingencies involved here, significant amount with a lot of the items not being settled in terms of where the location is. We were kind of throwing around the idea of moving the site. With that, there would be some transmission modifications as well. Well, done a little more looking at that, and we're gonna attempt to utilize that north space to the extent possible. But it will take some work by utility staff to do a little subgrade exploration as to where the old water tower was, any old foundations that may be in that behind the existing sub. But there's a potential to use that existing site. It's just going to be addressed in a preliminary phase of the design in order to set the table, so to speak, for this project. So that is something that we'd like to get started on when you guys have had a chance to make a decision on this. But essentially, there are some things that might impact that 5.1. That could be lower, and these are budgetary figures. So keep that, I guess. So 5.1 for phase one, we envision that happening in the next 2 to 3 years, really. It addresses the age and condition of the north sub that's 50 years old now. Addresses the loss of the south substation switchgear bus. So today, if you were to lose the south substation switchgear, you would not be able to backfeed with your generation or feed your distribution system through the north substation right now. So that's kind of our primary concern. I should note that HKS has been authorized to construct the tie temporarily for the old north sub to backfeed the system until a permanent north substation project is completed. So that's in the works. It's planning to be done later this summer. That's all in the works, and Pat's kind of spearheading that right now with the contractor, and I believe you guys have seen much of that information, I think. So phase two, mainline improvements, south portion of the system. Currently about 1.3, 1.4 million for those distribution bolstering projects for the south part of the system, especially important for feeding any future EV chargers that are going to be going in. We know at least one is pretty much a for sure deal, as well as if additional are brought on at Carl's or just being on that I-80 corridor. That's something we looked at, and that addresses low voltage conditions, assuming that the north substation project's completed. So if that ends up not happening, then we got to do some major distribution improvements in the south part of the system and look at things that way. So then phase three, we have looking out a ways towards the end of the 10-year cycle, and that's looking at upgrading the generation capacity to meet the peak at that time frame. So we expect there to be a peak of about 4.7 megawatt. In order to backfeed your system with generation adequately, you'll need to install additional gen assets, and we estimate that it'll be around $3.5 million. Those costs they're almost getting dated as we speak. So it's out there long enough that it's not something we can dial in on right now, but it's a budgetary figure, need to be dialed in at the end of that 10-year cycle. But our primary goal is phase one and phase two completion. So essentially the summary is over the next 10 years, about 9.8 million. Not going to break our heart if phase three doesn't get done. Just the nature of that is the N-1 and the voltage drop and the backfeeding capacity of your system in phases 1 and 2 are the ones that we really want to emphasize as being important going forward. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Blair here. I don't know if you have any questions on any of that we went over, any refreshers I need to do quick.
Jared, you talked about in phase three, if we do phase three, that we're gonna have to put in some more generation equipment. Are we talking about like another diesel engine then, or?
Yeah, potentially. You could go a couple different routes there, but that would be the initial look because you have, two, consider them cat engines in enclosures. The decision will be okay, well, how big does that next unit need to be? We'll look at growth. We kind of assumed with our estimates that it would look similar to the existing installations at the south sub. There's some pros and cons to the enclosure, depending on how much generation and what the transmission and environment all looks like.
Right.
What is the generation capacity of of MISO, of the area, the greater area. What does that look like in 10 years? That is gonna weigh heavily too, to maybe incentives for combustion generation at that point. But yeah, in a nutshell, additional one of those at a minimum. But there are other things you could do in terms of, you could install a gen plant building. If you wanted to look even further down the road, those allow, the gen plant would allow provisions for future generation additions, not just individual metal enclosures. So there are a lot of weedy details there that would need some, assessment at that time.
I would guess that in 10 years, there may not be a whole lot of, desire by anybody to put in more diesel generation. But hopefully by then they'll come up with something different,
Right, maybe a mini nuke or something.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into that. What we're seeing, and I'm not an expert in this, but surprisingly, we're kind of seeing the need for communities such as Stuart to actually have that generation capacity, because with the renewables, there is an instability effect to the grid. And so there's some interesting things going on with transmission markets and generation capacity at a very high level that, oddly enough, we're seeing incentives in other parts of the region where they're actually incentivizing diesel. So it's counterintuitive. It really is, depending on what you hear in the media, et cetera. You don't really see the real picture, unfortunately, and I guess we'll see. But it's certainly possible, with legislation that we have no clue what's going to happen in the next 8 to 10 years. So that figure is more of it's putting something out there to make sure that we're looking at it, and at least about it, something to prepare for financially. So,
Okay.
So it's a good question. Larry? All right, get out of your way.
Okay. All right, so I'm Blair Metzger, with PGR. I was here last September, I think, I've been here 2 times, so hopefully you remember me a little bit, but I'm the guy that talks about rates and finances. So a quick review, and I'll tie into Chip here in a little bit later. We're gonna need to talk to him before we're done with this, but so in 2018, I did a full rate study. Those of you who were on the board then or around then, I did what I would call a full study. And the purpose of that, or the reason for that, was in 2017, you had started doing some significant capital projects and had done some financing with Jeff, and we needed to get the rates all in place to handle that. So this is kind of timely in that this is sort of the next phase of needing to do those kinds of things. I'm going to tie back to this in a minute, but so I had looked at the longer range estimate of what your rates would be at that time, and I said in 2023, where we are today, that I thought you'd be charging 14.7 cents a kilowatt hour average. Okay, I'll tie back to that in a minute. So since that time, there have been some small adjustments that have been made. I mentioned I was here last September. If you recall what was going on there, that was the huge natural gas spike. Everybody was going crazy, and rates and costs were going through the roof, and we needed to do something to adjust to that. So we did a 3% increase back then. Thankfully, it's really settled down since that time, and I think things are in much better condition than they were then. I haven't had any recent conversations with CIPCO, but I'm guessing that they're in pretty decent shape from what they thought they would be, as long as natural gas dropped, which it did drop. So that's all good. So tying back to what I said earlier, your actual revenues now will be are expected to be in this year 13.9 cents. So you're actually behind what I thought you'd be by almost a cent, which is a good thing. That's what you want. I was conservative, and things didn't happen in as bad a way as we thought they would be. So for what it's worth, what we thought the rate payer.
So for relativity, what does that number to for Guthrie and Adair County RECs?
Okay, I've got some of that. So I'll talk about that in just a little bit, if you don't mind. I'll tie that in. And some of that's hard to compare because it ties into things like energy cost adjustment factors and things. But I did look at that, so I'll talk about that in a minute if that's okay. And then just in summary, you've kept your reserves at a good level. You're in solid shape here. You're meeting debt service requirements and all those things that are required for the bonds that were sold in 2017. So that's kind of where you're at today. Things are in good shape. Your rates are lower than we thought they were gonna be, still, rates are what they are, they're covering the costs and taking care of the financial things. So if we look at what does this mean to do the work that Jared talked about, how do we swallow a $6.5 million project in the next 5 years, which is a big number for you. As he mentioned, it's phases 1 and 2 of the capital improvements that are really needed in the next short term here at about $6.5 million. So here's what I've been doing for you kind of on a more or less continual basis is keeping your financial model, I call it, up to date, your cash flow. I update that just about every year to kind of see where we're at, to make sure we're meeting debt service coverage and keeping reserves where they should be. And so I was able to take that work that I do kind of on an ongoing basis and quickly throw in to that model what happens if you spend $6.5 million. And this is high level at this point. This is where we need to tie back into Chip and start working with him if this goes forward. But so the initial part of that $6.5 million could be funded with existing reserves and some of the operating margins we would expect in the next couple of years. In other words, you've got some cash available to kind of get partway through this. However, we are going to have to fund part of it with some debt. And my quick initial estimate is about $2.75 million of it. So a little less than half of the project would need to be financed. We could work our way partway through this. We could go down a year or two down the road, but probably by 2025, we're going to need to have some outside financing to make the rest of it happen. And so that's kind of the way it looks today. If this goes forward, next steps usually would be to tie in with Chip and start figuring out what this looks like and how do we set this up and how do we time this and can we structure this in certain ways that have less rate impact and those kinds of things. But just looking at the high level for now, that's kind of the picture. It looks like you have to finance about maybe 40% of this project with some financing. So then the question becomes at that point was, well, what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean for rate increases? We've talked about financing and borrowing money, but what does that mean to your ratepayers? So what that means is that it would take, in my estimation, based on my initial work, a series of what I would call modest rate increases over the next 5 years to swallow that new debt service. So, you've got additional debt payments, principal and interest payments that would come on. You'd have to pay for those somehow. So I'll show you the magnitude of those here in a bit. So, but if you do some what I would consider modest increases for a few years, you can swallow that project. The question was asked, and I think it's a good question, is what do this? What would your rates have to do anyway? And the answer to that is, well, you've got decent reserves. If you don't have to spend $6.5 million, you don't have to do anything, which makes sense. And I kind of prove that. That's really not an option, but that is something that we wanted to kind of see once. What part of these rate increases are associated with a project versus what would be like power supply or other operating costs. And so, unless something really crazy happened on the power supply side, you wouldn't have to do anything. However, if we proceed with that $6.5 million project, then yes, you're gonna have to do some rate increases. And so this is my initial look at things. Again, just doing a real simple modeling of the debt service payment over, I think I use a 20-year payment schedule, but that again is this kind of thing that we work with Chip on. But I'm showing a couple 4% rate increases starting soon, as soon as you want to get it in place for the next 2 years, and then after that, 3% increases for 3 years. And then once we get to 2029, we'd have rates adjusted where they need to be fine at that point. No more rate increases because of this project.
So is that exclusive to this project and has nothing to do with our input costs going up?
Correct.
So it may not be 3, it could be 6.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I've got that built in. Unless something like what happens with the natural gas prices in a war in Ukraine, that kind of thing that nobody.
But how much have we raised these rates over the last 5 years, independent of any project?
So we raised them, I think, just a 3% this last September. I don't think they've been raised since 2018, I think. Am I correct on that? Yes. That's right. Okay. So, like I said, it's had that natural gas thing not happened, you'd have had no rate increases at all for 5 years. To me, a 3% rate increase is, what used to be considered to be sort of magnitude of inflation kind of numbers where people kind of understand cost of living goes up every year. Obviously, inflation is much higher than that the last couple of years, but so I call these modest rate increases. No rate increase is loved by anybody, obviously, but these are not huge numbers. If you do them, if you spread them out and do it, every so often over the next 5 years. So, so this is going to get to tie back a little bit to the question you had earlier about how does this put you in line with others and so forth. So first of all, if you did that, so I said 13.9 is your average. And what I mean by average is that's what the whole system is. The system average cost per kilowatt hour is just a touch under 14 cents. And if you did my rate increases that I showed there in my 5-year plan there, you'd be up to 16.5. So it'd be about an 18% increase over 5 years, which makes sense if you think about it, 3% or a little over per year. That adds up to be something about 18% over the next 5 years. So what does that mean contextually? And that's kind of the question I think that we were trying to get to earlier. So a few ways to look at that, I guess. If you read the papers, if you follow the media at all, the average increase for residential customers in 2023 is 13%. So that's what most people in this country are paying for increase this year. You had a 3% increase. So when you talk about increases, again, nobody likes them, but the fact of the matter is electricity costs are going up everywhere and have gone up everywhere. And 13, I threw that in there because that's a 13% increase in 1 year that most people across this country have seen. You didn't see it, but most people did. And so that gives a little bit of context of what this means. So to answer the question about how does your cost compare with other utilities that you compete with, if you will. So it's hard, the bottom point there is it's hard to compare commercial customers because they pay demand rates and energy rates and depends on the load factors, and it's really hard to do that without looking at each one individually, so I didn't look at that so much. But the residential customers, you wouldn't be the highest, but you're not the lowest either. You're right, kind of in the middle. I forget, I have to look at which one of the co-ops is higher than you, for sure is higher than you. One of them it appears to be lower, but I have a question on whether or not they don't pass through some power cost adjustment things that happen. Some do that and don't show up on their rate schedule.
So is that 13.9 an all up average?
That's for the whole system for everybody, yes.
Okay, so what would that same number be for Adair and the same number be for Guthrie, not residential?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't have access to that information. They might be able to give it to you. I don't know. I mean, they're not not a public utility like you are, so they don't have to provide that, but they may have that available.
I mean, Guthrie Center, I guess Greenfield would be on Adair. Is there another community close that you have to compare? Like, I mean, tax rates are comparable by
Sure.
cities.
Yeah, I'm doing a rate study right now for Winterset, and I don't remember what the number is off the top of my head, but it's in that same area.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not an unusual number for what I call non-WAPA locations. If you're lucky to be west of here and get a lot of power out of Missouri, then your rates are a little bit lower. But anybody that's not in that, which is anybody east of here and east, you're going to be somewhere in that area. That's not unusual. I would guess that, and I would guess the co-op average would be real close to that also.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a similar power supply arrangement. So, if you want more details, you want specifics, I can certainly give it. I looked at it quick to see once how that.
I wasn't here in 2018, so I'm sorry for the dumb question.
No, that's a good question actually. So anyway, that's kind of what I have here. I'll let Jared talk about next steps. But is there any other questions on does this help provide context? Does it give you some input as far as what this means to you?
Have you cash flowed this out, the financial? So that's how you arrived at your 18% over 5 years?
Yep.
So if you look back over the last 5 years, how many millions of dollars has the utility fund borrowed?
So the last one was in 2017. I don't remember what the
A
number.
little over 5 million.
5 million. And so what's the term on it?
It goes out to 2034. And the debt service is about 450,000 a year.
So then, again, like we did with that, when we were talking before, we had that budget model for something exists like that for the water fund, or the electric fund as well?
We have one and as well.
Okay, so before the water project, in the ballpark again, we were at 20%. Before the $7 million afterwards, we're closer to 10. So what does that do to our profit margin as well for the electric? Because we're borrowing twice as much.
Later.
What?
What's their net profit roughly after?
Well, I think they're like $500,000 roughly before capital, and that's operating as I recall. It's positive, you know, a nice positive number.
Yeah, I guess I'm talking debt service, talked about what's the gross profit, or the net profit. You got gross revenue, you got net profit. Divide the one into the other, what's that rate right now? What is it after the debt service?
Yeah, I didn't look at that number. They calculated
Okay.
easily enough, but, so what we do for municipals is we look at things on a cash flow basis, and we're a little bit different than an investor-owned utility that has to make a rate of return. We don't really look at it that way. We just make sure that we have enough cash around to pay off. Jeff's people that he deals with, keep them happy, keep some reserves around, and you know, that's kind of what we look at doing. So this, I'm gonna step on Jerry here a little bit, but so I think, you know, if you move forward with this, which we hope you say, let's get started. The next move for me is to talk to Jim about how do we look at this, how do we structure this? Can we structure this debt in a way that has less impact? I just assumed a flat 20-year repayment schedule. There are ways to step that in, move things around. I don't know, if refinancing is in the cards of the old debt, I don't know where that's at.
You could refinance them for a lot higher rate though.
It's callable in 2025, so it's something to be evaluated as you look at the next.
You know, so all those things would kind of be next steps. If you say, yeah, let's get going on that we would want to get talking to each other and modeling things and talking back and forth, so.
Blair, does this include any enhancements for EV out on the interstate? I mean, does this planning include that?
So these projects allow for future EV interconnection. There are concerns that that's not possible without investment in the north sub. So these don't outright, they're not installing charger stations, et cetera, but particularly like the south main line improvements we have pegged there, I'd say those are pretty important once those EVs start coming online, because there's just a bottleneck of capacity on your distribution system with all the 1-aught. You guys need the 4-aught main line to transfer load between north part of the system and the south part of the system. So, for that. So
We had some information about the DOT was gonna do some grants with those types of infrastructure improvements in mind. Sarah and I are supposed to be on their mailing list, but I haven't heard anything of you, Sarah. Do you guys have any insight on that?
I don't have any specific insight on that. I'm aware of what you're talking about, but this whole concept or conversation is really interesting because, and you especially here are more exposed to it, if you will. Because if you happen to have a certain type of charger station get put in here, and you might because you're on the interstate, that's a big load. We're talking multi-megawatts of load.
Yeah.
Whereas, I live in Rock Rapids, we're off an interstate, there's no way they're gonna put one of those in there, there's no truck traffic or anything like that. So, but you, where you're located, could have that happen, and that's the real challenge I see, is how do you prepare for that? You don't wanna build a whole bunch of system and then if it never happens.
Never happened, yeah.
But if it does happen, you're gonna need to. So that's the challenge.
Well, I think I've heard of some chargers up and down the interstate now. So I think.
Yeah, Tesla has supercharger locations, I don't know what the closest one is, I've looked at the map, but I can't remember.
yeah, I know over the Shelby. They've got it set up there. I've yet to see anybody charging any on those, which is what I find to be amazing, I guess.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hoopla about it. I-80 is an identified corridor, and I've kind of looked at some literature Pat's passed along, and it's kind of pegged as kind of an area that needs them between, Des Moines and west here to Omaha, like that. They've pegged that as where they're gonna target. As far as covering the costs for some of that stuff, I think there probably are grants. If you guys are forced in to accommodate one of them, I don't see how they don't have some sort of funding to supplement that. And in kVA transformer is what you assume when you plop it in one of those level 3 fast charger stations. Pat, what do those cost these days?
50 to 60,000.
So those are things that I would expect there to be grant money for that are their direct purpose is to support a charger. And for a community to do that, I'd say that that's kind of an unfair thing, especially if the community itself is not using it, it's just passerby. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, this looks at that. We've got accounted one 750 kW transformer in our long range plan here. If that goes to 2, then your load projection kind of gets goofed up and is accelerated a little bit. So we're still not seeing them plug in very often. I have yet to see anybody charging on a level 3 when I do see them. That might just be coincidence, but you do notice that stuff because it's driving things. It really does have an impact.
Well, I think for those of us who live in Stuart, who are residents here, I mean, you can plug a charger in your 110 outlet, and it'll charge overnight. But when you talk about somebody coming into the interstate and wanting to charge their electric vehicle, you're talking about a stage 3.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and the real, so there's an infrastructure challenge that Jared talked about, but there's also a cost and rate issue, because they're not good load factors. In other words, they come on with big load on, but don't draw much energy. And we've seen some metered information from some existing Tesla supercharger locations, and they're horrible for cost wise. And so, we'll have to figure out how we handle that. I don't know how that is at this point, but. And there's a whole bunch of EV related stuff that will need to happen eventually anyway, such as time of use rates, that if you do charge in your garage, you want them to do it at night, not during the day, and that kind of stuff. Those are all things as this rolls out further, we could be working on, so.
I expressed my concern with the water fund term and the interest cost. There's a 1% rate benefit to do that. Again, the before projects, profit margin being at 20%, after it being at 10. My concern would be this being such a large debt to do the same thing to the utility fund or the electric fund. I'm just being upfront about that. So I don't know, if we're gonna end up being at that 40-year term on the water fund in order to get some of that profit margin, customers were at 1%. Anything like for the electric? Yeah, I'm sorry if it's a dumb question.
No, you can go out as long as you want with the electric debt. If you,
I just
I
heard
wouldn't look at 40 years though.
No, I'm just saying this
there's
this
not a
infrastructure is 50
subsidized-
years old, right?
Say that again.
This infrastructure is 50 years old.
Yeah.
That you're replacing.
Yeah.
I don't have a vocabulary for that, so whatever you were describing means it's so. But back on this other, that's a lot of debt for a fund.
Just keep in mind, they were talking about just under 3 million of the project costs being debt financed, the rest from cash reserves.
Right, but we don't know what the